we're really exploring today specifically an alternative perspective to female reproductive health and pelvic symptoms. So we're exploring specifically some of the main, common symptoms that women experience, and just looking at them from this perspective. And obviously what I'm sharing is not any kind of medical advice. It's totally up for you and anyone, watching this recording to like feel into what actually resonates and what doesn't. And it's like a perspective that we can integrate into our already existent practice and lifestyle. However we already understand our health and well-being, whatever we're already practicing, this can sort of supplement it. I still love to work with herbs and herbalism, and other natural modalities, and kind of just use this to support those practices. I'm going to be doing a little slideshow that I quickly put together last night. It's a little bit of a lazy slideshow, but I wanted to include some images. So all of the images that I'm sharing, as well as a lot of the information, comes from learninggnm.com. This is, and I'll link it when I post this in the group, but learninggnm.com is one of the very few resources out there that is like a cohesive website with not every single symptom that exists, but like the majority of symptoms. It is a somewhat confusing website. Like when you're not, like, it took me quite a while to actually understand it and be able to use it. But it is an amazing resource for symptoms in general. So what I'll do is I'll just begin with a quick overview of German New Medicine, which I'll be referring to as GNM. This is like a paradigm, really, more than it is a modality. It's like a paradigm of thinking and relating to our body and the world. So it's really helpful to understand it to some degree as like a foundation. Don't worry about, understanding and integrating everything I say, because it can be a lot. What's most important is just like getting an idea of like what the nature of the paradigm is, so that when we get to symptoms, it's like, oh, okay, this makes more sense because I have a context for it. And then we'll just go through some of these symptoms. We're going to be talking about ovarian cysts, UTIs, yeast infections, Bartholin cysts, and just like general inflammation, irritation of the vulva and vagina. So things like vaginitis and vaginosis and those kinds of things. GNM is the proposed science of the mind-body connection. So in GNM, it's understood that different parts of the brain are inherently connected to different tissues in the body. Essentially, every part of the body could just be categorized as a tissue, right? Organs, bone, doesn't matter what we're looking at. Every part of the body is just a different tissue. So this connection relates to both our evolution as a species as well as embryology. So embryology is the study of the development of a fetus and embryo. So when an embryo is developing, there are three primary germ layers within embryo development. And a germ layer is simply like the primary layer of cells that form during development. So an embryo develops in three primary germ layers. The endoderm is the innermost germ layer. The mesoderm is the middle germ layer. And the ectoderm is the outer germ layer. So you can kind of see in this image, we have a cell with the endoderm in the middle, the mesoderm outside of the endoderm, and then the ectoderm on the outer rim. And you can see on the images here of this little fetus developing, you can see the tissue, right? The endoderm is that innermost tissue. The mesoderm would be like the skeleton tissue, right? And then, as well as some other tissues. And then the ectoderm would be that tissue that you can see, that purple tissue developing on that fetus. So the embryo and fetus is developing in these three layers. Now, certain organs and tissues actually derive from a different germ layer. And this is acknowledged even in mainstream science, right? In mainstream science, it's understood that the endoderm gives rise to things like the liver and the lungs. And you can see on this image some of the different tissues that are derived from each germ layer. So in GNM, it's understood, right, this connection between germ layers and different tissues in the body, but it's also understood that different parts of the brain are actually connected to different germ layers. So the brainstem, for example, which is the oldest part of the brain, governs the organs and tissues that derive from the endoderm. So lungs, liver, colon, pancreas, uterus, prostate, these are all organs and tissues that derive from the endoderm and are governed, therefore, by the brainstem. The mesoderm, which is that middle germ layer, gives rise to breast glands, ovaries, testicles, bones, and muscles. And that's either going to be ruled by the cerebellum or the cerebral medulla. So in GNM, the mesoderm is broken down actually into two sections, the old mesoderm and the new mesoderm, and those will be ruled by either the cerebellum or the cerebral medulla. And then the ectoderm, which is that third germ layer, is going to give rise to skin, specifically the epidermis, bronchi, larynx, cervix, bladder, and rectum. And all of these tissues will be controlled by the cerebral cortex. And of course, within the cerebral cortex are smaller cortexes, right? But in general, the cerebral cortex will rule all of those tissues. So this is how GNM ties into embryology. And this is going to set up just a more cohesive understanding for how emotional conflicts will then adapt tissue in the body. When we understand that every tissue has its own category in germ layer category, and then therefore will have its own specific relation to a part of the brain. So within the context of GNM, certain emotional conflicts are related to different parts of the brain. So for example, if we look at the brainstem, which is the oldest part of the brain, we'll see conflicts that have to do with reproduction, respiration, food, right? So this is where GNM ties into evolution, right? Because every stage of our evolution actually feeds into the current coding and programming our bodies have right now. We're still operating on very ancient coding, right? So if we think of the conflicts we would have had in early evolution, they would have been primal needs. It would have been breathing, eating, and reproducing, right? Which is why that oldest part of the brain is going to relate to these sorts of conflicts. But if we look at the cerebral medulla, which is a newer part of the brain, newer than the brainstem, we're going to see conflicts like self-devaluation, right? Which is quite an evolved conflict to have, because in order to have that conflict, you have to have a sense of yourself, right, consciously, and a sense of your own worth. So the theory of GNM is that every emotional conflict will influence a part of the brain, because different parts of the brain govern different tissues, right? So every emotional conflict will influence a tissue in the body. As an example, and we can see here in this little image, right? We have the brainstem as the ancient part of the brain. We're working with really ancient conflicts: breathing, eating, reproducing. When we look at the cerebral medulla, we see a much more evolved part of the brain, and so we're going to see conflicts of a more evolved nature. And this is like just a simple reference point to how we can understand how certain conflicts are affecting certain parts of the brain, right? Like, why would the brainstem be specifically related to very primal conflicts? And that would be because it's a very ancient primal part of the brain. So if we're going to use an example here, the sensory cortex is linked to the biological conflict of separation. Okay, so the sensory cortex, by the way, is just a part of the cerebral cortex. It's just a smaller part of it. So a separation conflict is either I want to separate from that thing or that person, but I can't. I didn't want to separate from that thing or person, but I was separated. Or this sort of push-pull of I want to separate, but I don't want to separate, but I do, but I don't. Okay, so the separation conflict is linked to the sensory cortex. And this means that when someone has a separation conflict, it can actually be seen in a CT brain scan. So within the sensory cortex, a sort of disturbance in the shape of a circle with concentric rings can be read by someone who is skilled in a CT scan reading. So this theory has literally been backed up by brain scans. And you can see in the image here, right, this CT scan shows a fluid accumulation in the area of the right sensory cortex, where you can see those little red marks. It's kind of marking out the sensory cortex. And this is where the epidermis on the left side of the face is controlled. So this person who we're looking at an image of their brain had an eczema type skin condition on the left side of their face. And we can actually see this in the brain scan. So when a separation conflict is active, the sensory cortex is being affected. And because the sensory cortex governs the epidermis, this conflict will manifest in the epidermis. Now, this all happens simultaneously because it's all connected. So a conflict runs simultaneously in the brain as well as the tissue. So interestingly enough, the vast majority of all biological conflicts will show symptoms not when you're conflict active, but when you're in resolution. So this means that most symptoms occur when we're already in the healing stage. So in the case of a separation conflict, when you are conflict active, meaning you're actively experiencing the separation conflict, you will essentially the tissue of the epidermis will start to adapt through ulceration. And ulceration is cell loss. So you can kind of see in this image here, it says here ulceration, and this is the conflict active phase, which you can see underneath. So when we're looking at the epidermis, whenever we're going to be conflict active, the epidermis will always adapt through ulceration, which is losing cells. So during this phase, you might not actually have any noticeable symptoms. Sometimes there can be some dryness or flakiness of the skin, but you're not going to notice it. And when you resolve the conflict is when the tissue goes into repair. So you can see this red section next to the blue section where it says, tissue restoration, swelling, inflammation, bleeding, itching, edema, which is swelling, right? This is how tissue heals. It heals through swelling. It heals through redness, inflammation, itching, right? And there's first the edema, which is swelling, and then there's scarring. And all of that belongs within the healing phase. So the healing phase then would be cellular proliferation. And proliferation simply refers to the creation of more cells, right? So essentially, if the first stage of conflict active was losing cells, then naturally the resolution would be to replenish the cells that you lost. So anytime we see cell loss, right, as a conflict active phase, healing will always occur through cell growth and vice versa. So with most conflicts, the healing phase is where the symptoms arise, okay? Redness, inflammation, fluid, swelling, bleeding, itching are all healing symptoms. They are all symptoms of repair. And this is where GNM vastly differs from mainstream medicine, because mainstream medicine sees symptoms as something is wrong. We need to fix this. We need to heal this. Whereas GNM will see it as the healing phase, right? This tissue is already in resolution. So eczema is not something wrong with your skin. Rather, it's the healing phase of an intelligent adaptation from a separation conflict. So in this paradigm of GNM, there is no sickness, because sickness suggests something is wrong, right? The body is not operating as it should. So in GNM, when the body breaks out, or the body vomits, or swells, or aches, it's not perceived as sickness, as a flaw, as a fault or mistake with the body. It's understood as an intelligent tissue adaptation. It's your body taking care of itself. And most of the time, symptoms arise when healing has already begun. And this is really understanding, like, from a bigger perspective, that like healing is painful, right? It's the healing that typically causes pain and discomfort, not just physically, right? But also sometimes emotionally. So we begin to perceive symptoms from this paradigm not as a problem, not as something we need to fear, but rather as a highly intelligent communication from the body. So one note that I want to make here are some exceptions, right? So if you are poisoned, that will cause obviously serious symptoms that are not linked to an emotional conflict. If you are injured, right, if you're experiencing something biomechanical or some kind of blunt force trauma, that's obviously not going to be because of an emotional conflict. And of course, malnourishment will also cause serious symptoms in the body. So these are sort of exceptions, right, that we have to acknowledge. So what this doesn't mean is that symptoms are quote unquote psychological, or that the psyche is going to cause symptoms, right? Because biological tissue adaptation runs simultaneously with emotional conflict. So this is a holistic paradigm in which the mind slash brain slash psyche exist in union with the body and physiology. So emotional conflicts and biological conflicts are the same thing. They all run simultaneously. So I want to clarify what an emotional conflict is because it's very specific. Within GNM, emotional conflicts are always preceded by a conflict shock. So an emotional conflict isn't just the general experience of being conflicted, right? It's a very specific experience that literally runs on your body and brain simultaneously, and it requires what is called a conflict shock. A conflict shock is an experience that triggers an emotional conflict. So a conflict shock would not be, I broke up with my partner, right? It's not the general experience of having broken up with my partner. A conflict shock is at 12:01, I was in a relationship with my partner and I didn't have an emotional conflict. At 12:02, I was no longer in a relationship with my partner. More specifically, at 12:02, my partner said, I don't think we should be together anymore, right? Or whatever would have been said. And that moment is the conflict shock. And from that moment arises the emotional conflict. A conflict shock is something that takes us off guard, something that we're not really prepared to deal with. And though we might have theoretically have the skills to deal with it, in the moment, we actually don't feel like we can. And another criteria here for the conflict shock is emotional isolation. Okay. So feeling isolated in some kind of way, like bearing the conflict on your own, right, is required for an emotional conflict and for a conflict shock. So any type of shame or embarrassment or tenderness that we might have around certain experiences will obviously create emotional isolation, but also just like having an intense experience that you just aren't ready for, right? It's very easy to naturally feel alone in that moment within that experience. So typically the conflicts within our symptoms are things we don't want to talk about, right? Think of how something that is traumatizing can make us feel alone, right? This is why breaking the spell of emotional isolation is essential to resolving emotional conflicts. As long as we are in and maintaining emotional isolation, we are going to keep that conflict alive, right? This is also why so much of our emotional conflicts and so much of the paradigm of GNM is actually taking place in the subconscious, right? Because we can kind of just sort of push things into our subconscious and not fully be present with them, observe them, witness them, speak to them, process them, right? I also want to add that a conflict shock is perception. It is not the actual experience, right? Two people could get in the same minor car accident, right? Two people could get in a fender bender, and one person has no emotional conflict. They do not experience a conflict shock, whereas the other person does, right? It's all perception. It's kind of like how children can have the same parents but have totally different experiences, right? Being very sensitive can make you more susceptible to conflicts, right? You might perceive certain situations as a much bigger deal than other people. And when you experience things that happen to trigger your wounds and traumas, you will, of course, be more likely to have a conflict around it. I had a lot of symptoms as a child compared to my twin brother. I was always sick. I always had something going on physically. And I was a highly sensitive child, and I felt everything around me very deeply. It was very overwhelming, but I was also very prone to emotional isolation. And even though I was deeply emotional, I just didn't have the ability to share or express my emotions. And even as a really little kid, like I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't express any kind of sadness or worry. I just didn't have that tool. And that made me very prone to having conflicts because I was just alone in it all the time. And it was something that I had to teach myself, later. And my current practice now is like whenever I notice symptoms or conflicts, I talk about it. I tell my husband all about it. I'll just like word vomit, everything that I'm thinking and feeling about this thing. And it really helps me break the spell of emotional isolation, which I can be prone to. This is also why, in general, kids are so prone to getting sick, especially once they start going to school. Because as a child, you're experiencing everything for the first time, as far as you know, right? You're experiencing everything for the first time. It's all new, so everything is taking you off guard. You're having these first time life experiences, right? If you are in school or in a daycare or some kind of care away from your parents, you don't necessarily feel the support that can be stabilizing and comforting. So that's going to make you more prone to conflict. And also, you're a little kid, so you can't talk about your feelings, right? So, this is one of the perspectives we can take on like children getting colds and sicknesses all the time, especially when they start going to school and start interacting with their peers and having all of these, emotional experiences that they've never had before. So, when a conflict shock occurs, it triggers the emotional, biological conflict that will run in the body and brain until it's resolved. When the conflict is resolved, the body goes into the healing phase, which is typically when symptoms will occur, right? There are a few symptoms that actually will occur when you're conflict active, but the vast majority of the time, symptoms occur when you're in the healing resolution phase. When we see cases of chronic symptoms that persist, we're looking at what is called a hanging healing. Okay. So a hanging healing is sort of like a emotional conflict that you have going that you maybe start to resolve, but then you like open it back up again. Or maybe you resolve it, but then shortly after you sort of step on that conflict again and you reignite it. And this is what we call a track. A track is something that triggers your conflict, right? So if we are every single day stepping on a track, or even multiple times a week, or a couple times a month, right? It can sort of become this mini conflict shock that is reigniting the original conflict, right? So an example of this, when I was a kid, I would always have this red, flaky skin behind my ears. And my mom thought it was food allergies. But she was very good at making sure I didn't eat anything I was allergic or intolerant to. And yet, I just constantly, for years and years, from around maybe like 3 or 4 to like 7 years old, I would have this weird, flaky skin behind my ears. And this was a separation conflict, right? We just talked about how separation conflicts affect the epidermis. And it was a separation conflict I had with my dad. So I was very close with my dad. I was the real daddy's girl, and we had a very close connection. And I was also very physically affectionate, and I needed a lot of kind of physical connection and attention. And he was working a lot at the time. And so he would leave for work in the morning, and I would run this conflict, right? I would be conflict active. And then he would come home, and sometimes I wouldn't see him for a couple of days because he would come home so late. But when he would come home and I would see him, I would instantly go into conflict resolution and I would go into the healing. But then he would just leave again, and I'd open it up again, and then he would come back and I'd go into healing. So when we're seeing something like a rash that is just like always there, just a little bit, always alive, right? We're seeing something that is just like a hanging healing, this conflict that is opening, resolving a little, but never fully being able to be resolved. So a track doesn't have to be something that happens to us from someone or something in the external world. It can also be like what we're thinking about and what we're processing. So, for example, I've run a lot of self-devaluation conflicts, right? Feeling like devalued, a low sense of self-worth around money, right? So, feeling devalued or unworthy because of blocks or issues with money. And whenever I'm running a conflict with money, I get a very particular pain in my back muscles. So, devaluation affects muscles, amongst other things like bone and connective tissue. So I always know when I'm running this conflict because I will get this like very particular pain in the middle of my back. And I can stay in that hanging healing for months. And I think I've stayed in it in the past for like up to a year, just continuing to return to that conflict. And the original conflict might have been triggered by a conversation with my partner about money or a look at my bank account. But I'm keeping it alive because, maybe I'm thinking like, oh, I want this thing. And then I realize, oh, I don't have the money for it. Or, oh, I'm seeing something on social media and it's like reminding me of my money problems. And now I'm like having like every day just dropping into this little, conflict of like, oh, not just an issue with money, but the way that it makes me feel, which is devalued, right? So that's an example of like another sort of hanging healing that one can keep alive. So anything can become a track that kind of keeps your conflict running, but knowing the original conflict shock can be really helpful in resolving our symptoms. But it's not totally necessary, though it is helpful. So we're going to move into the reproductive symptoms. I'm just going to read your little message here. I remember times when I used to feel a lot as a child but would not be received by family members, and I think I subconsciously programmed myself not to feel any more into my teens until I was able or willing to develop skills on my own or with others. I'm trying now, though, in my 20s. Yeah, so that experience of like not being held as a child can deeply like increase that susceptibility to emotional conflict. And we can also say that like a lot of emotional conflict is like trauma, right? It's like this charge, this thing we experience that we don't have capacity to hold and to navigate. And I love what Gabor Mate says about trauma, which is that it's not the actual thing that's the trauma. It's, for example, in a child, how that child is supported in dealing with it. It's what happens right after, right? And that's also a helpful way to look at emotional conflicts. It's not the thing that happened, right? Which is why it's so important not to gaslight ourselves or gaslight others of like, well, come on, that was barely anything. That was like a tiny thing. That person just said that thing, and now now you have a conflict about it, right? It's really important to completely just like hold a really loving, compassionate like space for ourselves and understand that we're allowed to have these conflicts, and most of these conflicts are arising from within the subconscious, which is why sometimes we don't even know we're running that conflict. I've had quite a few symptoms where every time I would look into the emotional conflict, I was like, oh no, I'm not doing that. I definitely like separation conflict. I don't have separation conflicts. And then after a while being like, oh shit, actually on a subconscious level, there is a big part of me that is having this conflict and holding on to this. So whatever our ego identity is of ourself will definitely get in the way sometimes of being able to fully address our emotional conflicts, especially if we're experiencing a conflict that is like goes against the way that we understand ourselves. So, ovarian cysts. Let's move into some of these symptoms. So, when we are looking at ovarian cysts, we are dealing with the ovaries. Okay, so the ovaries is the tissue/organ in which adaptation occurs. So the ovaries are derived from the new mesoderm. And the new mesoderm is part of the mesoderm, which is that middle germ layer. Now, I love these images here. These images come from learninggnm.com because you can see when you look at this image of these reproductive organs, you can see they're categorized in different colors. And what's amazing about these colors is that they actually refer to what germ layer those organs originate from. And they also refer to what part of the brain they're ruled by. So we can see here that the uterus and fallopian tubes are different than the ovaries, right? Because the ovaries are ruled by the new mesoderm and the uterus and fallopian tubes are ruled by the endoderm. So we know just by looking at this image that anything coming up in the uterus and fallopian tubes are going to be related to the brainstem. Whereas if we're looking at the vagina, which is this red color, that's going to be related to the cerebral cortex. So anything that's yellow essentially is going to be related to the endoderm, anything orange is related to the mesoderm, and anything red related to the ectoderm. Now, the cerebral medulla is what is governing the ovaries because the cerebral medulla governs all tissue in the new mesoderm. Now, you'll notice that actually these germ cells, right, within the ovary, you can see this little yellow point, right, that is the germ cells. So this means that even though the ovaries are ruled by the cerebral medulla, the germ cells are actually ruled by the brainstem. So if someone has like ovarian teratoma, which is a germ cell tumor within the ovaries, it actually wouldn't fall into the category of ovarian tissue adaptation, right? So this is why it's really important when we're having symptoms to really identify like, where am I actually having this symptom? Like what part of the body is actually adapting? So when someone has a conflict in the ovaries, it can be seen in a CT brain scan in the area of the cerebral medulla. And in the male body, this same part of the brain would relate to the testicles, right? Because the ovaries and testicles are actually like obviously have a very similar function. So we're looking at a loss conflict. And here's just an image, a couple images of the brain scan, right? So we can see these little rings that are sort of noticeable. Obviously, you have to be pretty good at reading a brain scan to be able to see this. But essentially, anyone having symptoms like ovarian cysts, for example, will have this sort of circle target ring in the cerebral medulla. When we're looking at the biological conflict here, like I mentioned, we're looking at a loss conflict, okay? So this would be a conflict concerning the loss of a loved one. Now, this could be the fear of losing someone, right? It could be the loss of a pet. It could be losing someone through death, through a breakup, through a miscarriage, an abortion, any kind of situation with a partner, family member, friend, in which you perceive having lost that person in some way. So this particularly concerns the loss of a living being. It wouldn't be the loss of a home or some kind of object, right? This is the loss of a living being. And that person doesn't have to be dead, and they certainly don't have to be completely out of your life, but you are perceiving and experiencing that you have lost this person, this being in some way. This conflict can be kept alive by a lot of like self-blame or regret or like holding on to, you know, that this being, that this person or animal is somehow lost to you in your life. And it could also be the conflict of like not having conceived a child and that experience of loss. Whenever we're looking at emotional conflicts, the way in which GNM describes them can be very like simplistic and sometimes of a very primal nature. So loss conflict is obviously very general, which is why it's important to, it can be really helpful to listen to people's stories, especially if you have like a specific symptom, to actually explore some of the stories that people have had related to their own symptoms, because it can give us a clear idea of how a loss conflict actually affects us as humans, right? Because it can be a lot of things. So during the conflict active phase, right? You are conflict active with a loss conflict. Cell necrosis begins. Cell necrosis is cell loss, right? It's that ulceration, okay? So you start to lose cells in the ovaries. This also means that your estrogen levels will probably decrease because of the loss of the estrogen producing cells within the ovaries. Now, depending on the intensity of this conflict, you could have some irregular periods, some lack of menstruation, or some infertility issues. This is if it's like there's enough cell loss to affect your estrogen. So the intensity of the conflict is always equal to the intensity of the symptoms, right? So a little conflict is a little symptom, right? A big conflict is a bigger symptom. And also how long you're in the conflict before you start healing, right? You can always tell how intense the conflict was, how long you were in it, by how intense your healing symptoms are. Now, depending on a person's handedness, whether they are right or left-handed, one can further determine the nature of the conflict. So, if a woman is right-handed, her left side is considered her mother-child side. This means that conflicts relating to either her children or her mother. Her right side, if she's right-handed, would be her partner's side. And this relates to not only her partner, but anyone else in her life, right? Any other person. Now, if she's left-handed, her right side becomes her mother-child side, and her left side becomes her partner's side, right? So an easy way to remember this is, if you're right-handed, which arm do you hold your baby in? If you're right-handed, you hold your baby in your left arm because you need to do everything else with your right arm, right? And vice versa. If you were left-handed, you would naturally hold your baby in your right arm so that you could do the things you needed to do with your left arm. So if the left ovary is being affected, right, and the woman is right-handed, it would relate to either her mother or her children, whether or not she has living children. It could also be a conflict about children who are not yet born. If it's her right ovary, then it would be related to a person who isn't her mother or child. And if she's left-handed, it would simply be the opposite. So while you're conflict active, you might not have symptoms, right? Because you're simply losing cells and it won't be noticeable. Unless you're losing enough cells that it's causing hormonal imbalances, then you might have some noticeable symptoms. But it's really during the healing phase, when you go into resolution, you start to resolve the conflict, that your symptoms will appear. And remember, if we've lost cells in the conflict active phase, we are going to have to regrow them, right, through cell proliferation in the healing phase. So cell growth will replenish the cell loss, and healing, which includes, swelling, right, will cause most likely some kind of pain, right? Pain is typically something we experience in the healing phase. So it's during the edema phase, which is that swelling phase that is always a part of healing, that a fluid-filled cyst will form at the site of the cell loss. Okay, so it's during the healing phase that you're going to have an ovarian cyst. Now, in the case that you don't revisit the conflict, right, you resolve it, you're good, you're done, it will actually take around 9 months to fully move through the healing phase, which is quite interesting because that's the time it takes to gestate a baby, right? Now, if the cyst becomes particularly large, usually it's because there's another conflict active that's causing the body to retain water, which is why the swelling of the cyst becomes so large. Polycystic ovaries, right, where you have like multiple cysts on your ovaries, would be multiple loss conflicts. Now, the cell proliferation, which is cell growth, which is part of the healing phase, actually occurs within the cyst. So the ovarian cells will grow and proliferate within the cyst. And when you move into the second part of healing, the cyst will become hard. It will remove itself from the tissue that it was attached to, and then it will return and reintegrate into its hormone producing function. So the biological purpose here is that the woman will now get a boost of estrogen, right? Because it's returned to its hormone producing function. And estrogen makes a woman more attractive, right? We know that when we're in our follicular, especially our ovulation, when we have a ton of estrogen, we feel more attractive and we can often be perceived as more attractive, right? So the biological purpose here is the body has just experienced a loss, right? And because it's affecting the ovaries, there's typically, the body has this very primal evolutionary response to conflicts with the reproductive system, where it often wants to resolve conflicts with pregnancy, right? Very ancient evolutionary program. So you've just had this lost conflict, you've now recovered, you've now resolved, and now you're going to get this boost of estrogen so that you're more ready to mate and potentially, experience, something in balance to balance that loss. So the body experiences loss essentially and wants to make up for it by making a baby. So again, this coding is very ancient and very rooted in our ancient evolutionary history. We're running programs that on one hand might feel sort of outdated, right? Like they're not relevant anymore. But on another hand, they truly are relevant in the sense that they really serve our spiritual evolution, because these symptoms reveal our subconscious to us. They reveal our behavioral patterns, our wounding, our trauma, our fear. They reveal what we're holding on to, right? Right? So by working with these symptoms in this way, even though they might be sort of outdated, right? It's actually still serving our evolution on some sense, on some level. So any organ that comes from the mesoderm, that middle germ layer, will always reveal its biological purpose at the end of the healing, like the ovaries do. The ovaries reveal the biological purpose of adaptation at the end of healing by returning to the hormone function, the hormone making function, and making the woman more ready for mating and reproduction. Whether or not you actually want to do that, right? This is just what the body is doing. Now, if the cysts burst, they can actually attach to the abdominal wall and start to develop outside of the ovaries. And this is actually another perspective of what we call endometriosis. So when women with endometriosis get a CT brain scan, they actually have a conflict in their cerebral medulla. Now, this is important because the mainstream perspective of endometriosis is that it affects the endometrial lining. But the endometrial lining is ruled by the brainstem. And yet when women with endometriosis get CT brain scans, you don't see any target rings in their brainstem. You actually see it in the cerebral medulla, which means it's most likely related to the ovary. So this is a potential perspective on what endometriosis really is. Ovarian cysts bursting and starting to attach to and grow in the abdominal wall. So that's our ovarian cysts. And by the way, any questions, anything we want to review or talk about or share, we can cover at the end of these symptoms. So moving on to the UTI, the urinary tract infection. Here we're dealing with the bladder, mucosa, and urethra. So these are the tissue and organs that are affected when you're dealing with a UTI. The bladder and urethra are the lower part of the urinary tract where UTIs will arise. As we can see, it's ruled by the ectoderm, right? Because it's red, which means it's controlled by the cerebral cortex. The reason that the bladder and urethra have two brain relays, if you see on this image to the right, it says temporal lobes, top view, and then it says, it has like the right brain relay, and the left brain relay. So the reason for that is actually that the bladder used to be two organs. We used to have two bladders before they evolved and formed into a single bladder, which is why the brain relays are separate. There's the right side of the bladder and urethra, and there's the left side. And that's simply because of a more, ancient programming. So when we are looking at the emotional conflict for a UTI, we are looking at a marking conflict. So for a male, a UTI is more related to a territory marking conflict, which is a bit different. but for females, it will be a marking conflict. So a marking conflict is a little bit trickier, right? Because when I say loss conflict related to the ovaries, it's easier for us to be like, oh yeah, losing someone, that's relatable. But a marking conflict can be a little like, what does that actually mean, right? And remember, these conflicts are of a deeply primal evolutionary nature. A female marking conflict relates more to a breach of inner boundaries. Okay. So, another thing that this can look like is not being able to establish boundaries, either feeling that your inner boundaries have been breached, right? Or something that you feel is your territory has been breached, or literally not being able to establish your boundaries. So we can think of how an animal will mark its territory when it feels that the boundaries of that territory have been breached, right? And how does an animal mark its territory? It pees, right? So this gives context as to why marking conflicts will affect our urinary tract. So an example here, I had a period years ago when I would get pretty frequent UTIs. And at the time, of course, I was not remotely aware of what they were about. But now looking back, it's very obvious to me. They were of a sexual nature. I was seeing someone who was very nice and we had a very good rapport, but sexually, our dynamic was quite intense. And I was not able to sort of set boundaries, essentially. I wasn't able to kind of I didn't feel that I was allowed to. I was quite young. I didn't feel that I was allowed to set boundaries and still kind of have fun and have this like wild sexual dynamic. Um, so I would often find myself in that moment, right, during sex, actually having a conflict that I wasn't really aware of, right? Not being able to set boundaries, feeling that my inner boundaries were actually being violated, but I didn't really know how to navigate it. And I would get these really, really intense UTIs. So the conflict doesn't actually have to be sexual. I think very often it can be, but it could also be like your home being your territory. I've heard stories of women like having really intense UTIs after after all the COVID regulations and feeling like they weren't allowed to go anywhere or do anything, right? So their local community and spaces that they were very connected to that were sort of like their territory, that was like taken from them. And then when they finally, those, regulations were lifted, they suddenly were like, oh, I've got it back and got a very intense UTI. Another great example is like your home, your space, someone coming into your space and feeling like it's like that's your sacred space and they're breaching that inner sacred space of yours. That can be an example here. Dogs and cats often get UTIs for similar reasons, for territory and marking conflicts as well. So yeah, the marking conflict can be a little tricky, which is why we have to remember to like get into like the primal energetic of it. This idea of feeling like, okay, there was some violation here, there was some breach of a boundary, whether my own body or whether a space of mine that I feel, connected to, that feels like it's a sacred space of mine. And yeah, and it felt there was some kind of violation felt, there was some kind of breach experienced. When you're conflict active, you are experience again cell loss, right? Cell ulceration. And you're going to experience this in either the bladder mucosa or the urethra or both. And remember, it's always proportional to the degree of the conflict, right? So the biological purpose of cell loss here is to create more space in the bladder and urethra to better improve urine flow, to better mark territory. Okay. So you're conflict active, your territory, your boundaries, your body, whatever it is, it's feeling violated. And on a primal level, your body wants to piss all over your territory to claim, like, this is mine, right? And so what happens is you start to lose all these cells in the bladder and urethra to literally create more space for more urine, right? To hold more urine, to be able to like have a stronger urine flow, right? So there's also a connection here with whether you're right or left-handed. I'm not going to get super into that since it's not as relevant as it was for the ovaries, but I have a little chart here on the slideshow if that feels relevant for you. If you can really feel, maybe you can really notice that it's the right or left side of your bladder or urethra. You could use this little chart. Most of the time, I've never been able to feel that. To me, a UTI just feels like my whole bladder and urethra. So when we move into the healing phase is when symptoms occur, right? So you're starting to resolve that conflict. You're feeling resolved in it. The first part of the healing phase is cell proliferation, right? We're replenishing those lost cells. There's going to be swelling, pain during urination, blood in urine, feeling like you have to pee all the time, right? Now, typically, we don't need to be concerned with a UTI, right? Because it'll run its course. Now, if you are running another conflict, which is causing water retention, I mentioned this earlier, okay, the water retention conflict. It's also what causes ovaries to become like incredibly large, right? If you're running a conflict like this and you have a lot of water retention, it can increase the swelling so much as to actually block the urine flow in the urethra. So in this case, you will not be able to release urine. It will be totally blocked. So I'm not talking about like you're peeing all the time and therefore you only have a little pee because you're constantly peeing. That's normal, right? To do these like constant little pees when you have a UTI. I'm talking about a total block in your urine flow, okay? This is rare, but in the case that this happens, okay, that's when you want to seek medical attention and get a catheter put in. We don't need to worry about UTIs unless our urine flow is completely blocked, right? Which would mean there's like serious swelling happening. And it is never good for the body to be blocked in urine flow. That is a pretty serious condition. So in the case, again, it's rare, but in the case that happens, that's when we want to seek medical attention and get a catheter put in because we need to be able to release urine. So when you reach the crisis of healing, which is often called the epileptoid crisis, right? So that's, you're like peaking in your healing, all right? This is when we can experience some cramps and spasms. You might not experience it. Again, it depends on how intense your conflict is. But this epileptoid crisis, if they're really intense, and this goes for any epileptoid crisis, healing any kind of conflict, when they're really, really intense, we can experience some dizziness, some fainting. We can experience like a significant drop in blood sugar. So if I find myself ever getting like super lightheaded, I typically understand it as like, I'm resolving something right now, right? And typically I have some kind of other symptom going on. The second part of the healing phase, an infection can occur, right? And in GNM, it's understood that bacteria assist in the healing process. So bacteria will actually arise and there will be an infection. Now, if the UTI symptoms persist or the infection lingers, this is where you're stepping on the conflict track like again and again, and you're not allowing it to fully heal and resolve. But if you go into resolution, right, and you feel resolved, you'll have your UTI, you'll have your symptoms, and then the healing phase will complete, right? It's only if we're seeing these symptoms persist, not really go away, maybe the infection gets worse, then we're seeing a hanging healing, right? So that is UTIs, urinary tract infections. Moving on to the yeast infection. So here we're dealing with the uterus and fallopian tubes. Now, sometimes a yeast infection occurs in the Bartholin's gland, okay? We're going to cover that after this. So yeast infections can be caused by a couple different things. First, we're going to cover the uterus and fallopian tubes, which is one of the tissues and organs in which yeast infections can arise. So the uterus and fallopian tubes are derived from the endoderm, which means they're governed by the brainstem. There are two conflicts related to the uterus and fallopian tubes. The first is a procreation conflict, which could also be called an implantation conflict. And this can be miscarriage, abortion, not being able to conceive, right? Wanting to be pregnant. But it can also be not wanting to be pregnant, right? Like you ever go into a panic about hoping you're not pregnant, this can actually trigger a procreation conflict, right? Being kind of concerned with pregnancy. A loss of a child or a grandchild can also be a procreation conflict. Now, obviously, these sound quite similar to potentially the conflicts we talked about with the ovaries, right? Of like miscarriage and loss. And the thing is, a lot of these conflicts can kind of overlap. And you could experience, for example, the loss of, a fetus, right? You could experience a miscarriage, the loss of a baby, and you could have both ovarian cyst and yeast infection, right? Like you can have one single conflict shock and have multiple symptoms and emotional conflicts arise from that one conflict shock, right? You could also have two women who experience the loss of, of a child, or have an abortion or miscarriage, or, have a conception conflict, and one could have an ovarian cyst and one could have a yeast infection, right? Because they're having a different texture of experience, because it's about perception, right? So the one conflict is procreation, anything to do with procreation, wanting to have a baby, not wanting to have a baby, and everything in between. The other conflict here that relates to the uterus and fallopian tubes are a gender conflict. So a gender conflict can be a few things, right? It can be literally a conflict with a male. So if you're a female, an ugly conflict with a male, feeling humiliated, insulted, abused, disrespected by any male. This could also be a distressing gynecological exam, but anything from like husband, partner, ex-husband, divorce, boss, authority figure, right? Any conflict with a male that feels ugly to some degree, that feels disrespectful, that feels uncomfortable, right? This can be a gender conflict. Gender conflicts can also be related to your relationship with your femininity, your womanhood, or your female body. So for example, here, like I had a period some years ago where I would get yeast infections quite often, probably like once or twice a month. And I was still healing from a sexual assault. And it was actually not until I got together with my now husband that I started having these symptoms, right? So the whole year before I was together with him, right after I'd been assaulted, I was actually constantly conflict active. So because I was so active, like I was like not remotely healed or resolved around this experience, I wasn't having any symptoms. And it wasn't until I got together with him and was able to explore like sex and sexuality in like a comfortable, safe space, I started having all of these symptoms. And one of the most common ones was yeast infections. And I realized that I was having definitely a gender conflict where I would feel like I was getting into a conflict with him, even though there was truly no conflict between us, right? Again, this is perception. Essentially, I would feel during sex because I still had all of this trauma. And I actually, for the first time, felt safe to, while having sex with my partner, feel all of this trauma in my body. I would sometimes go into this like triggered state where I would feel like, oh, he's disrespecting me, he's doing something wrong, right? And he was very like gracious and held space for me to do that. But I was having these essentially these male conflicts with him, right? Where I was, processing all of these really ugly conflicts with a male that I had had previously. And I was kind of processing them with him. And then, of course, resolving them very quickly because I was in a safe space to do so. And then having these constant yeast infections every time I was kind of falling into that track and then resolving it. Another example here could be, feeling like having a hard time with like, oh, I'm a woman and I have my cycle and I have to go in, and it's hard to be in the world, and and be in this body because there's no space for this body, there's no space for my female body. That can be a gender conflict that that can trigger something like a yeast infection. And I think I've also had a couple yeast infections after like pregnancy scare years ago, like getting super freaked out that I was pregnant, and then some weeks later, or even just a week later, getting a yeast infection. So those are a couple of examples. When we're looking at the conflict active phase, we are looking at cell proliferation. Now, this is different from the other symptoms we explored. If we remember, the previous symptoms we've looked at, in the conflict active phase, there's cell loss, and in the healing phase, there's cell proliferation. Okay, but in this case, we're looking at first cell proliferation, cell growth, and then cell loss. Okay, now the biological purpose of increasing the cells during the conflict active phase is to thicken the uterus mucosa so as to make it more hospitable of an environment for implantation, right? So remember, the body often perceives pregnancy as a solution to reproduction conflicts. So this is funny because you could give yourself a procreation conflict because you're scared of getting pregnant, and your body will try to resolve the situation by adapting the tissue so as to make you more hospitable for pregnancy, right? So this is a very ancient evolutionary coding. During the conflict active phase, there's also an overproduction of prostaglandin. You might have heard of this term before, prostaglandin. Prostaglandin is a hormone-like inflammatory marker that is known for increasing menstrual cramps, okay? So the uterus will contract more strongly than normal. All right. And this actually, by the way, this is another interesting perspective on having really painful periods. Okay. If you're having painful periods every month, or maybe there's only some months you have them, that could be the healing phase of maybe having a gender conflict. Conflicts with your own body, your own female body, conflicts with men, conflicts with procreation. That's another perspective on having really, really intense periods, because that overproduction of prostaglandin, which is a part of the conflict active phase, is going to increase, it's going to increase your menstrual cramps. But remember, that overproduction of prostaglandin will occur when you're conflict active. However, if you're having a lower intensity conflict, you might not notice really any symptoms, right? It's in the healing phase that we're going to see the symptoms. And this is where we see cell loss, right? Because we've just created a bunch of extra cells in the conflict active phase. We have to remove them, right? So bacteria or fungi will appear to assist in breaking down and removing the cells, right? This can also be accompanied by night sweats. In general, if you find yourself randomly having night sweats, you are probably in a conflict resolution. You're probably healing something, right? Especially if you don't have them often. The cell breakdown, right? The fungi and the bacteria are most likely appearing to break down the cells, okay? That cell breakdown is going to be excreted through the vagina. And this is the common symptom of the yeast infection, right? The yeast infection is fungi breaking down all of these extra cells and releasing them from your body. Now, the theory of mainstream medicine is that the discharge is happening in the vaginal canal. But from this perspective of GNM, it's actually happening in the uterus and fallopian tubes and traveling out of the body. And that sort of cheese smell, right, that we can have with a yeast infection would be the presence of fungi helping to break down the cells. So now we move to the Bartholin's gland. When we're looking at a Bartholin's cyst, which can be a little cyst that develops in the location of the Bartholin's gland. We're dealing with the tissue of the Bartholin's gland, which we can see in this little image. These two yellow little circles here on the sides of the vulva are where our Bartholin's glands are located. As we can see, they are derived from the endoderm, which means they are ruled by the brainstem. Now, the purpose of these small glands located on either side of your vulva is that they secrete mucus to lubricate the vaginal entrance to prepare for penetration. So when your body is getting aroused, right, and your body is preparing itself for penetration, these beautiful glands are secreting this mucus and lubricating everything so as to make for an easy penetration. Now, the conflict that occurs when we're looking at the Bartholin's gland is insufficient lubrication prior to penetration. Now, this is a much simpler conflict to work with because it's pretty obvious, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's literally the conflict of not being able to produce sufficient vaginal mucus. So this could be insufficient foreplay, right? Not actually being warmed up enough before penetration. This could be discomfort during sex because you're actually not lubricated enough and so it doesn't feel good. This could be like not actually feeling ready for penetration, but like, okay, we're just going to do it anyway because I don't want to be difficult and take forever to warm up, you know. This could be like a gynecological exam, right, where something is inserted. It's uncomfortable because your yoni is actually dry and not ready and not lubricated for something like that. But typically, this is something that's going to come up during sex, right? So a personal example, I used to get Bartholin cysts quite a lot as well some years ago. Mine were very small. They were like the size of a grain of rice. They were very, very little, but they can also get really, really large. So we remember the intensity of the symptom is proportional to the intensity of the conflict, right? So if you have a very large cyst, we're looking at most likely a conflict that was pretty significant for you, right? Whereas a little bit of a cyst maybe was not so intense of a conflict, or maybe you just weren't active with the conflict very long. So it's important to remember here that the female body needs 30 to 45 minutes for the tissue to fully engorge and be ready for penetration. Okay, the female body takes time to be fully lubricated and ready, not just lubricated, but for the tissue to soften and be receptive for penetration. Lubrication also requires the parasympathetic nervous system. You need to be in a state of rest, of relaxation. Okay, and this is so important for women to honor, and it's so important for, you know, especially any men in our life, any male partners to understand and to honor, because, you know, bypassing that truth and, you know, engaging in penetration when we're not quite ready because of maybe a pressure that we feel to do that can literally lead to to symptoms, right? So let's look at the conflict active phase here. Okay, and this is just a little image of a Bartholin cyst, by the way. That's one of the things it can look like. Okay, that's a little bit of a bigger cyst. So in the conflict active phase, we are seeing cell proliferation, right? Cell growth. So just like the uterus and fallopian tubes, right? When you're conflict active, there is cell growth. The biological purpose of cell proliferation is to make penetration easier by adapting the secretion of the vaginal mucus. So this is like, last time we had sex, it hurt and we weren't ready. So now we're going to make a bunch more cells in our Bartholin's gland, right? We're going to make a bunch more cells so that we're super ready to lubricate next time. So you're probably not going to have any symptoms, right, when you're conflict active. When you are in the healing phase, you're starting to resolve that symptom. Fungi or bacteria will come to assist in breaking down and removing all of the cells. If fungi appear to assist the breaking down of cells, right, because now we have to lose cells because we just created a bunch of them. If fungi appears, this is a yeast infection. So I mentioned before that yeast infections can be caused by a couple of things. It can be coming from the uterus and fallopian tubes, which means it's either a procreation conflict or a gender conflict, or it can actually be coming from around the Bartholin's gland. which would mean it is a lubrication conflict. So the fungal discharge here will excrete through the vaginal opening, just like it does in a yeast infection. But in this case, the vaginal discharge is originating in the Bartholin's glands and not the uterus and fallopian tubes. If it's a more intense conflict, an abscess or cyst will form. So you could be running this conflict, this insufficient lubrication before a penetration conflict, and when you go into healing, you might not have a Bartholin cyst, right? You might just have a yeast infection. If the conflict is of a more intense nature, then you'll get that cyst, right? So if you're having recurring conflict relapses, like you keep having this relapse into especially having a cyst, it can, all of the cell adaptation that's happening in the Bartholin's gland can actually lead to some vaginal dryness that can be kind of long lasting. Interestingly enough, men can get a yeast candida infection on their penis from the conflict of not being able to penetrate a vagina that isn't lubricated and ready. So this can explain a man and a woman getting a yeast infection at the same time after intercourse if dryness was an issue, right? Another thing here is that antibiotics can cause vaginal dryness, which is why women sometimes will get yeast infections after an antibiotics course, and also sometimes get Bartholin cysts. So just an example here, this was a conflict that I was getting also with my husband, partner, boyfriend at the time. I was recovering from sexual assault. I had a lot of trauma active in my body, and I would often experience like I wouldn't be quite ready for penetration. And instead of vocalizing it, right, because I had this sexual trauma, which made it really difficult for me to use my voice during sex, I wouldn't say anything. And I would just be like, well, I want to have sex, so we should just do it. But in truth, even though I wanted to have sex, my body physically was simply not ready, right? So I wasn't lubricated enough. And I resolved that conflict by recognizing and acknowledging it, right? And then talking about it to my husband and, talking about like this is what I need to be fully ready for penetration. This is like what I require, and this is what happens if I don't feel ready. And, he was understanding of that, and that became like the norm, right? That became like the norm of how we relate to each other sexually, right? Making sure that I am absolutely fully ready, because that's what the female body requires, right? 30 to 45 minutes of something that's arousing you, right? Whatever that is, feeling fully warmed up. Yeah, so that's a little bit of a more straightforward conflict to work with. It's a little bit more obvious. Finally, we're going to move to just like any kind of redness, irritation, inflammation, itchiness, heat in the vulva and vagina. So here we're either dealing with the vaginal mucosa, which would be like the inside of the vagina, right, is irritated and inflamed. Or we're dealing with the epidermis, which would be that outer skin on the vulva, right? So the external genitals. And in that case, these symptoms would be the vulva, right? Rather than the inside of the vagina. So both the epidermis and the vaginal mucosa are derived from the ectoderm, which means they are governed by the cerebral cortex. Okay, they're governed by the same part of the brain. And the specific part of the brain that they're both controlled by is the sensory cortex, okay, which is just a part of the cerebral cortex. If we remember when I mentioned eczema and skin stuff as an example earlier, I mentioned that the epidermis is ruled by the sensory cortex, right? So with vaginal stuff, vulvar stuff, we're dealing with either vaginal mucosa, which is that inner vagina, or the epidermis, which is genitals externally, which would be the vulva. Now, the conflict for the epidermis is a separation conflict, and the conflict for the vaginal mucosa is a sexual separation conflict. So we're going to explore both, but they are quite similar in nature. So A sexual separation conflict is what adapts the tissue in the vaginal mucosa. Okay, so this could be, remember, separation can be wanting to separate from, it can be like having been separated from and you're having a hard time with that, or it could be this push pull of like, I want to separate, but I don't, but I do, but I don't. Okay, so this could be the loss of a partner. You lose a partner in some way. This could be sexual rejection. This could be being cheated on or suspecting that you're being cheated on. If your partner is having erectile dysfunction and you're not able to have that sexual experience with them, maybe there's some like sexual frustration of like, I can't get that sexual experience with my partner. That could be related as well. It could be this feeling of like, I'm separated from my sexual partner, or I'm separated from sex with my partner, and I wish I wasn't, right? It could also be wanting to separate from sex with your partner. It could be like painful sex, awkward sex, a lack of connection during sex, for whatever reason, during sex being like, ooh, I don't actually know if I want this. And maybe having that like push pull of like, do I want this or do I not? Or, that kind of, conflicted feeling that we can have during sex. So this is a separation conflict, but of a specifically sexual partner nature. When we are conflict active, we are in cell loss. All right. So the purpose of cell loss is to decrease your sensitivity, right? So there might actually be a numbness. You might notice it, you might not. It's typically maybe less likely to notice numbness inside your vagina. For a lot of women, they already have quite a bit of numbness in the vagina. But essentially, a lot of the cell loss, if you lose a lot of cells, it can lead to vaginal dryness, which can, of course, lead to lubrication conflicts as well. But whenever we are losing cells and we're dealing with like the epidermis or the vaginal mucosa, anytime we're dealing with a separation conflict, the reason you're losing cells when you're conflict active is to decrease sensitivity so that you don't have to like deal with it, right? I don't want to feel this, so I'm going to lose sensitivity literally in my skin and mucosa so that I don't have to feel it. Or I wish I was feeling this, but I can't because I'm separated from it. So I'm going to lose sensitivity so as not to feel it. It's a biological coping mechanism, essentially. When you move into the healing phase, we are replenishing through cell proliferation. So the symptoms here can be vaginal itching and pain. This could be like vaginosis, right? You're having like pain and itching in your vagina, but it's not yeast, right? There's no yeast because there's no fungus showing up here. And if there is discharge, it's going to be bacterial, right? So bacteria will show up to assist in the healing, but fungi will not, which is why you won't have a yeast infection. So if you're dealing with that itchy red inflammation in your vagina, but you're not having that yeast, right? Maybe there's like a weird smell or like a funny color discharge. You're most likely dealing with like a vaginosis type thing, which would be vaginal mucosa, which would be a separation conflict, because no yeast is going to show up here. If we are looking at the itching, redness, irritation, inflammation of the vulva, meaning we're looking at the external genitals, it's not inside the vagina, it's just kind of like around our vulva. We're still looking at a separation conflict, but it's of like a broader nature, okay? So this is most likely because of the location, right? The vulva. It's most likely going to be of a sexual / relationship / partner nature. Okay. The epidermis is also ruled by the sensory cortex, right? So it's very, very similar to what we just explored with the vaginal mucosa. This separation conflict is most likely going to be about a partner, but it could be related to your child, right? Because you birth through your vulva, right? But most likely it's going to be of a relationship nature. So this could be this like, I want to separate from, but I don't, but I do, this like pull push in a relationship. maybe you're like conflicted in your relationship and you don't know how fully committed you are. You don't know how fully committed they are, maybe there's some trust issues, right? Some kind of resistance, right? You're not fully on board. This like, do I want this or do I not want this? And maybe going back and forth. I have also gotten these symptoms from menstrual pads. So like I only use period underwear now, but I used to wear menstrual pads and I found them so uncomfortable because of like the material. I found it very uncomfortable and I would get really intense redness and itching and inflammation all around my vulva, which is literally a separation conflict, right? I want to separate from this thing. It's really agitating me. It's uncomfortable, and literally breaking out in like a rash. This is another perspective on babies getting diaper rash, right? Babies who are in the womb with no clothes, total comfort, right? No sensory stuff. And now suddenly they're born in the world and they constantly have this diaper on that's like squeezing them around their bum and it's like scratchy and there's all these textures and it's very overwhelming, right? And so often, sometimes we can get a separation conflict just from like a thing that we're constantly touching on our body that we don't want to be touching us. Because again, it's about perception. If you have a conflict with something touching you, you might, when you finally resolve that conflict, break out in a rash. So symptoms here can be a little bit broader, but if we're having these symptoms around the vulva, we're going to look at anything to do with separation, wanting to separate from, not wanting to separate from, or being pulled between the two. And we're going to most likely look in the realm of relationship and partner. It might not be specifically sexual though. When we're conflict active, just like with the vaginal mucosa, we are losing cells, right? Because we want to decrease sensitivity. There might not be any symptoms here. Sometimes there's dryness or flakiness. Sometimes the skin is a little cold because of poor blood circulation. But in general, you're probably not going to notice anything. In the healing phase, we replenish the cells through proliferation. There's swelling, redness, irritation, inflammation, and it's sensitive to the touch, right? And if these symptoms are coming and going, we're looking at a conflict that is remaining somewhat active. Maybe having small moments of resolution and then kind of opening up that conflict again. So finally, I just want to talk about the outer skin sensitivity pattern. So when we're looking at the vaginal mucosa and epidermis, we're looking at an outer skin sensitivity pattern, but we also see this in the bladder, mucosa, and urethra, which are behind UTI symptoms. Now, all of the organs and tissues here, vaginal mucosa, bladder mucosa, urethra, epidermis, they all have something in common. They're all derived from the ectoderm. So if you see this image, you can see there's this little image of this red fetus, and it says ectoderm, right? They're all derived from the ectoderm. So an outer skin sensitivity pattern, what that means is during the conflict active phase, there is cell loss for the biological purpose of hyposensitivity, which is numbness and decreased sensitivity. And during the healing phase, there will be increased cells for increased sensitivity. Now, again, there's a biological purpose here of coping, right? If you are having a separation conflict, you want to not have to feel where you're having that conflict to cope emotionally with it, right? Now, because in the healing phase, we have to replenish the cells, that means we're going to have increased sensitivity. This is why UTIs burn when we pee, right? There's like such insanely increased sensitivity because we're in the healing phase and we're replenishing all these cells. This is why UTIs are so painful and have such kind of an increased sensation to them, right? This is the nature of the outer skin sensitivity pattern. This is also why when we have like redness or irritation, our skin gets sensitive to the touch. So this is a little overview of some common symptoms and the emotional conflicts that can be related to them. And finally, I just wanted to quickly show this little image here. because I find it quite helpful. If we see here, we see these 4 different parts of the brain. We see cerebral cortex, we see cerebral medulla, we see cerebellum, we see brainstem. And this is kind of like, I guess, a little system that can be helpful to remembering how some of the conflict active and healing phases work. So anytime we're dealing with a tissue in the cerebral cortex or the cerebral medulla, the conflict active phase will always be the loss of cells, and the healing phase will always be tissue restoration with a growth of cells, right? And if we're looking at any tissue related to the cerebellum or brainstem, it's going to be the opposite. Will always be conflict active with cell proliferation, and then in the healing, there will be cell removal and cell loss. So that can be a supportive system, reference point, sort of. And then we can see here below the conflict active phase, and then the healing phase, which always includes edema and scarring to some degree, right? Depending on the intensity of the conflict. So I just finally want to talk about resolving conflicts, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it is no longer necessary. Here we are. And return my camera on. So, resolving a conflict is not bypassing it, okay? Resolving a conflict is not like, oh, I just won't think about it, or whenever I feel myself going into that conflict, I'll just like ignore it or get onto something else. Like I'll just resist the conflict, right? Because essentially, the more we bypass or ignore it, the more active it becomes in our subconscious, and our subconscious is a huge part of emotional conflicts. And biological conflicts and emotional conflicts often play out in our subconscious. So, an obvious example of this is like, I never realized that I had separation conflicts because I've always been someone who's very independent, and I love being alone, and I'm very introverted, and I'm very self-sufficient, and I was raised kind of to be that way. And so because of that like ego identity, right, that I have, I never, if someone was like, oh, do you have separation conflicts? I would have been like, are you kidding me? Never. I never have that problem. And yet, actually, separation conflicts have marked a lot of my life, and I've had a lot of the symptoms that arise from that. And it took me quite a while to be able to see that. And it was actually GNM and getting to know my symptoms that made me recognize like that this is actually a conflict that is deeply subconscious for me. It was a conflict that originated in my childhood. It was very painful for me, and I didn't know how to address it, so I completely disassociated from it. I had very little memory of it, right? So even though I never thought about separation conflicts and I never felt that I had that conflict, I was actually constantly running it subconsciously, right? So this is where we need to get into contact with that subconscious part of ourselves and get in contact with the texture and dimension and nature of the conflict, which can take time, right? Especially if it is something playing out on a very subconscious level. Sometimes we can read about a conflict and be like, oh, yeah, that's me. And sometimes there's a little bit more resistance because either it's something particularly painful or it goes so against who we think we are that we are not able to accept it, right? So locating the original conflict shock can be very supportive. Actually locating like, what was that first moment that got me onto this conflict, right? But it's not totally necessary, by the way. Like I've definitely resolved a lot of symptoms without ever locating the original conflict. My food intolerances, for example, that I resolved, I never necessarily went back to like specific conflicts. I just worked with my current subconscious and everything my subconscious was holding around food. But I've had other conflicts that I've resolved by locating that original conflict that was really helpful for me, but it's not necessary, right? If it's a conflict that is recurring, you're just like perpetually in this symptom, right? You have a chronic symptom. we really want to look at tracks, right? We want to be like, what is the theme that is playing out here that I'm keeping alive? And how do I keep returning to it? What are my thought patterns where I keep coming back to this thing, right? Or like maybe multiple times a day, I'm like dropping into this like this thought pattern that is reigniting this conflict for me. And then recognizing what are the tracks, what are the triggers to that conflict. Quick example, I had a period a couple years ago where I got the most intense acne, and I had had skin issues as a teenager, and they had cleared up after high school. And I was so happy like to have clear skin, and I had clear skin for some years, and then suddenly I had this year of just such intense acne, and it was so mortifying. I had such a hard time with it because I was like, I'm this like healthy person, and like I've had clear skin, and how can this happen to me? And with acne, it is typically an attack soiling conflict where you actually feel attacked and soiled because of how you look. So that's why you have an acne loop where like you have acne, you look in the mirror, you go into conflict about it, and then you actually continue to perpetuate the symptoms of pimples, which are just healing phases, right? So I recognized that one of my tracks was the mirror. Every time I looked in the mirror, which was multiple times a day, I would see my acne and I would be like, oh, I would look at it and I'd be like, oh my God, I can't, right? And then I would just get more acne and more acne. And I tried everything, nothing worked until I started addressing that conflict. And I started teaching myself every time I looked in the mirror to be really conscious, knowing it's a track, and to remind myself when I saw my pimples, this is a healing phase. My skin is brilliant and intelligent and healing. I'm not disgusting. I'm not soiled. I'm not dirty. There's nothing wrong with my face. My skin's just healing. And I actually taught myself to not go into that response, not by bypassing it, but by actually like acknowledging that it's okay and there's actually nothing wrong. And literally within weeks, my acne was gone after having it for like a year and not being able to resolve it at all. Okay, so that's an example of like addressing a track, figuring out what it is that triggers it, and then learning to be really conscious when you're engaging with that track or trigger. And essentially, it's like making peace with it, right? It's deeply making peace with like that this is a situation that I'm in, that these are feelings that I have, and making rather than trying to, I feel devalued, therefore I need to feel super worthy. Rather, can you make peace with the aspects of your life that you don't think are good enough? Right? So it's much more meta, right? We're not fixing anything, we're actually making peace with it and coming to full terms with it. Because a lot of this is working with our subconscious, the best time to do this work is when you're in bed about to fall asleep, okay? When you are falling asleep, when you're laying in bed, you have the lights out, you're falling asleep, your subconscious is incredibly active. So most of all of the kind of work that I've done with GNM, all of the times, the majority of the times I've remembered the conflict shock, remembered, oh, this is what it is. It was this moment 2 weeks ago that happened, or even remembering something from my childhood. It's almost all exclusively happened in bed trying to fall asleep, right? Or just like waiting to fall asleep. So, what I love to do is this is something that's very meditative because we're working with the subconscious, right? So, if I have a symptom, for example, let's find something more. Well, I don't have anything recent, but if I'm having a symptom, I would like lay in bed if I'm not able to figure out what the symptom is about. And I'll just kind of let myself drift into that like pre-sleep state, very meditative state, and just kind of start connecting to the symptom, to the sensation of it. How does it feel? Where is it on my body? And then I'll start thinking about what I know the conflict is, meaning like what is the GNM theme, right? Separation conflict, devaluation conflict, whatever it is. And I'll just start to like build a bridge between those two things. And I kind of just like wait and see if something comes up in my body. And very often, and I will say the more I practice it, the easier it gets for me. It took a little longer in the beginning to like learn how to do it, but now I can like lay in bed before falling asleep and just make all these connections, remember things from my childhood. Typically when you're making that connection, you can almost feel it in your body, this like awareness that comes online in the body. So if you're having symptoms and you feel that there's an emotional conflict behind it, and you can't quite figure out what it is, and you've read about it on GNM, and maybe you've heard other stories about it, I really recommend doing it before you fall asleep. That's when all the magic happens, because you're directly interfacing with your subconscious. If you have a meditation practice, you could also do it during meditation. That could also be pretty powerful as well. So if I were to get any of these symptoms that I've just mentioned, what I would do is, if I have any like things that I do, any herbal treatments or anything like that, I might do that to relieve the symptoms, right? And I also believe, by the way, that we can totally use other modalities with GNM, especially plants. Plants are such teachers. And I used to perceive plants as like, I need the physical constituents of the plants to heal my symptom. And now I see more as like the energetic signature and spirit of the plant is going to help support me in working with the conflict. So I always love to include plants when I'm having symptoms, but whatever your typical protocol is, you can do that. Sometimes when I get symptoms, I don't do anything at all. I don't worry about it. I just find the conflict, I resolve the conflict, and that usually quickens the healing. So that's one thing I just want to mention, like when you go into conflict resolution and you get your symptoms, right, which is typically when you notice you have something going on, because you don't notice it when you're conflict active. I've found that figuring out what the original conflict was that created the emotional conflict speeds up the healing process. So if I've got, for example, a yeast infection and I'm like, oh, I must have had a conflict that I just resolved. If I can connect to the moment that I had that conflict that resulted in the yeast infection, and I can like build a bridge between those symptoms, typically the healing phase will rapidly speed up, meaning I won't have the symptoms as long as I normally would. There's something about the body recognizing consciously, bringing from the subconscious what it was that originated that symptom. There's something about that that speeds up the healing process significantly. So even if I'm healing, I don't worry about it, obviously, because I know I'm in the healing, but I do typically try to find the original conflict because it almost always speeds up my healing significantly. I mean, I've gone to bed with symptoms, made a connection to the original conflict, and woken up the next day and they're gone. So I also just think it's like very fun for some reason. I just have a really fun time with it. But if I were to have any of these symptoms, I would connect to what the conflict is in GNM. I would connect to the symptom in my body, and I would meditate on like what that connection could be. And I would start to ask my body and give permission to my body to share with me, like, what happened? What was that thing? Can you show that to me? What was that thing that happened? And then I just kind of stay open to it, and we'll like think about it and contemplate it during the day and think about it before I go to bed. If I then find the conflict and I'm like, oh, I know what this is, I start to talk about it, because emotional isolation keeps us conflict active. So if I'm like, oh, I know what it is, I know I'm having this thing, I start to tell my husband about it, and I just word vomit onto him of like what's going on, and this is what I think it is. If you don't have anyone to talk to, I highly recommend journaling. Journal it all out. Just get everything out that you're thinking about and processing. And notice if your mind starts to take you to other places. Maybe you start to notice, like, wow, this is actually a thread that my mother has, or that I saw my father has, or like I've heard about people in my family having, because there's also a very strong ancestral piece to GNM. We can pass conflicts down to our children, right? The like energetic field of what a conflict is can get passed on. So I actually have a lot of the symptoms that my mother has, right? Especially the food intolerance thing, right? It literally runs through all the women in my family. So we can also pass that on. So just like allowing your mind to do its intuitive, beautiful thing and make all those connections. Somatic work can be really supportive here. So actually like going into the body, going into especially the area of wherever you're having symptoms and just connecting to that part of the body, doing some vocalization, just connecting to that tissue and kind of like having a conversation with it and asking it like, what's going on? What do you feel? What is the energy, emotion that you're holding? That can be really supportive as well. Yeah, and any other modality that you might use to work through subconscious stuff, to work through trauma or reprogramming, any kind of, personal healing modalities can be really supportive. And of course, not being worried about your symptoms, right? Because fear can actually create an emotional conflict, right? Freaking out over a symptom can actually give us another emotional conflict. But it can also increase our discomfort and pain. Like fear is a very powerful experience that we can have in the body, and it can really intensify our symptoms. So, what I love most about this modality or this paradigm is simply that we don't need to be afraid of anything in our bodies anymore. We can still be fully responsible without being in fear. Yeah, I feel like that's all that I have to speak to on that. And yeah, just, that was obviously a lot of information and reminding you that you don't have to intellectually have absorbed all of it, right? You actually don't have to like remember anything that I said specifically. This is recorded. There's a bunch of resources on the internet. I'm going to link the website, the Learning GNM website. What's most important is like, or like what I'm most curious about is like, what does it feel like to receive that information? Like to be like, oh wow, okay, imagine if I was in my body like in this way, if every symptom was just a communication. And to me, what GNM is really about is not learning all the specifics of it. You don't even have to learn it, right? Because there's so many resources out there. It's like acclimating and attuning to the paradigm of consciousness. That to me feels like being in total right relationship with nature and with the body. So yeah, and also being allowed to like receive what resonates. And if there are pieces you're like, I don't get that, or that doesn't totally resonate, knowing that you don't need it necessarily, right? Like we're allowed to integrate the pieces that serve us, in our journey.